scrounging for scraps. Your planet was on the brink of collapse. I'm the one who stopped that. You know what's happened since then? Children born have known nothing but full bellies and clear skies. It's a paradise.
Because you've murdered half the planet.
A small price to pay for salvation.
You're insane.
Little one, it's a simple calculus. This universe is finite, its resources finite. If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist. It needs correction.
You don't know that!
I'm the only one who knows that. At least I'm the only one with the will to act on it.
As part of our week looking at changing China, one of the programs that has dramatically changed China and is a policy that has undergone recent change is China's one-child policy, which is actually called the Family Planning and Population Control Program, but is commonly known as the one-child policy. So we're going to briefly examine that this week and how it has changed and what impact it has had on China over the last few decades. So the one-child policy started in China in 1979 and 1980. And obviously, if you look here at this graph, you'll see that the population of China in 1980 was about 1 billion people. And they could see that the line was going up at a pretty high rate. And they were very concerned. The Chinese government was very concerned about food and water and pollution and jobs, and they were concerned about education and healthcare and whether or not they could adequately provide a standard of living for, a significant population of people. And so they instituted a program that was very controversial, and we'll look today a little bit at why it was controversial. The one-child policy was never intended to be more than one generation long. So it was started in 1980, and it was to be finished within 30 years. And they were pretty close to keeping with that. It went a few years longer, but it was really to be just one generation. It was never intended to be a law or a policy that was long-term. So the one-child policy is called the one-child policy, but it's really not the most accurate term because while it did require some people to only have one child, it did not mean that everyone had only one child. So for the urban areas, which is a very big portion of the Chinese population, all right, but if you lived in a city area, then yes, you were asked, technically it was optional, you were asked to participate in the one-child policy. But there were a lot of different exceptions for the policy. So for example, if you lived in a rural area, you could apply for permission to have 2 children. This was typically given, especially if your first child was a daughter, they would oftentimes give you permission for a second child. If you were any of the ethnic minorities, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Manchus, Manchurians, any kind of ethnic minority, there are 56 registered ethnic minorities in China, they were excluded entirely. You could have as many kids as you want if you were non-Han Chinese. Also, there was permission granted for a number of other exceptions. If your child died, you could have a second child. If your child was severely handicapped, or if you had twins or triplets or quadruplets, you kept them all. If you were an only child, then you could apply for permission to have 2 children. If you owned a large farm, you could apply for permission. So we call it the one-child policy, but really it wasn't entirely accurate that every single person had only one child. There were a lot of exceptions to the rule. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the second question is, well, how would a government even enforce this program? Obviously, what we studied over the last few weeks, we get a sense for how much control the Communist Party has over China. So obviously they put laws in place to try to make people want to participate. There was not a law that you had to participate, but they did try to make things more difficult for you if you did not. Also, they used a very common idea with governments, and that's use propaganda. You try to sell your program. Governments through all of history and all around the world use propaganda to try to encourage people to believe in whatever it is they want them to believe. And the Chinese government did a masterful job of using propaganda. They convinced the Chinese people through billboards and posters and television commercials where you could be happy with one child, that you're bettering your country by just having one child, that the country is more important than what you want, and that if China is ever going to be the most developed country in the world and be able to be a powerhouse on earth, that they all needed to sacrifice, and that meant you should sacrifice whether or not you wanted to have more than one child. They used this propaganda, and they did it in a way that was very, very successful. They also used reward systems. They basically bribed people that if you did participate, you got a certificate and your child got the first in line for the best schools, the best health care. You as a parent got increased pay into your pensions. There were priorities given to those who participated. They also tied your one-child participation to your employment. This is where the program got a little heavy-handed. This is a lot where the controversies have come up with the program. So some businesses required people to participate in the one-child policy. You could lose your job if you violated it. They could fine you, etc. The government also used monetary punishment. So if you signed up to be part of the one-child program and you violated it, so that you accidentally ended up with a second child, you would have to pay an upbringing fee, basically a fine for your second child. That fine was pretty substantial. So for most Chinese people, it was more money than they could afford. If you were really wealthy, they just didn't care and they just paid the fines and it didn't matter to them. But to poorer Chinese people, these fines were really challenging. It's part of what led to children being abandoned and killed was because of the fines and the fear of those fines. They also utilized the community. They had these things called granny police that would go through communities and kind of keep track. And the government really invested into birth control programs that would come from the federal government and would be provided basically free of charge for anybody who wanted it. Most of that was pretty typical as to what you would find in any country around the world. The exception would be that China had a very, very high rate of sterilization. And again, this is where it became controversial. There are stories about women being forcibly sterilized by their employer, by people in their community, like this, horrible thing. So the birth control programs on its face was a good thing in that they promoted it. But at the second part of that is that not all of it ended up being entirely by people's free will. So that's how they enforced the program. They used all of these things, the propaganda, the benefits, the fines. The effects of the policy were probably what you would expect. It brought the birth rate down. It actually brought the birth rate down very significantly, as well as the fertility rate. So the population of China has continued to grow, but it's grown at a much lower rate than what it would have had they not instituted the one-child policy. So you'll see in the bottom graph, in 1960, they were averaging almost 6 kids per woman. This was 20 years before the one-child policy. Today, and actually it hasn't changed much over the last 20 years, their fertility rate is 1.6. So it successfully brought their birth rate down. There are other effects, obviously. When families were told that they could only have one child, or when they decided to do the one-child program, it put a lot of stress on gender. So if your first child was a female, some families would choose to either abandon their female babies, or they would abort them, or they would kill them. They would have high rates of infanticide because they wanted to be able to have male children. And so because of this, China today has the largest gender imbalance. So there are way more men in the Chinese society than women. And I know 119 to 100 doesn't seem like a lot, but you got to remember there's more than 1 billion people in China. So that's 19 more men for every, woman. And, you multiply that out and you get the kind of the gist that the problem here is there aren't enough women in Chinese society right now. Also, one of the effects was an entire generation of only children, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just different. And so there have been a number of studies done about what that has done socially to have a lot of kids grow up without any siblings. And then one of the things you'll hear more about in the clip that you'll watch here in a minute is that one of the challenges is dealing with an older generation with a very small young population. Here you'll see the population pyramid. We've looked at these throughout the year. You'll notice that it is not a wide-based triangle, so that's positive. It's not exactly a pillar, but it's getting there. But you can see on the population pyramid the challenge that China is facing as this middle section from about 55 or so down to 30, as this group continues to age, there's not as many young people to support that. So the one-child policy did what it was set out to do, which was to make their pyramid more pillar-shaped, but there is some, challenges they need to look at in terms of what's the long-term impact of that. So our theme this week is, how is China changing? So obviously this policy is no longer in effect. It actually hasn't been in effect for a number of years. People talk about it a lot, but it really doesn't exist. And it's been changed many times. It was amended in 2013. It was changed again. The law changed in 2015 so that by January the 1st of 2016, everyone could have 2 children, which is what the norm is now, and is it's sort of what the government has promoted. And actually there is a proposal that sometime this year, they'll actually eliminate any and all limitations on how many children people can have. In fact, in some places in China, they're really pushing for people to have more kids, and it's not happening. A lot of younger Chinese people grew up as an only child, and many of them are continuing to do it, even though the law no longer exists. So the policy is no longer there. Chinese people can have 2 children, and in fact, in many cases, they can have as many kids as they want. And it'll be interesting to see if this year they continue to change the final parts of the legislation and the limitations. So you're going to agree or disagree whether or not this was an effective and sensible program to deal with the concerns of overpopulation. So one last thing, just throwing this out there for those of you who might be interested in this topic. I have not watched this documentary because I do not have Amazon Prime, but it won a bunch of awards, including the Sundance Grand Jury Prize, and it is a documentary. I think it's like an hour and a half, maybe long, where they go and interview Chinese people from different generations about the impact of the one child. It's supposedly pretty interesting, but if you have Amazon Prime and this is something that sort of fascinates you, I just thought I'd let you know about it.